Welcome to this edition of Valor Media. This is episode number 84 for September 13th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mark Appenzeller. Today is the final installment in what has been a three-part series on the challenges that are specific and unique to the world of nonprofits. I called the series Boulders because I wanted to address the idea of obstacles that may not be quite as large as they seem, but if we ignore them and pretend that they'll go away, we'll undoubtedly at some point end up tripping over them. So today is Boulders Part 3, and I'd like to bring this conversation to a close, touching on a subject that truly is 100% in the realm of the nonprofit, and that's the whole concept of volunteers. Volunteers are really, by any stretch of the imagination, something that we don't really have a parallel for anywhere else in the business world. It's not very common that you hear somebody contacting a major corporation and saying, "Hey, I'd like to come work at night in your call center, doing cold calls, reaching out to people, and I just want to volunteer. I don't need to be paid." That's probably never going to happen, and if it does, I would kind of question the sanity of the person saying that. Because in the corporate setting, there's usually a really high level of pressure. There are corporate-wide expectations, many times set by boards of directors or shareholders who have absolutely no idea what's required to bring the daily grind about. And so for the person in that position, they absolutely need to be receiving some kind of financial compensation. You don't see people lining up to go into an environment like that unpaid. But in the world of nonprofits, we kind of come to expect, in many instances, that volunteers will be kind of the backbone of the organization. Depending on what the nonprofit is, depending on the scope of their mission, how long they've been in business, and particularly what demographic they're trying to reach, the level of volunteers can fluctuate. In some instances, particularly if it's a startup or a very small operation that has virtually no budget to work with, the idea of utilizing volunteers makes a lot of sense because the goal there can be to assemble a unified workforce without needing a lot of capital investment. But even for well-established nonprofits and ones who have paid staff, volunteers can still play a critical role. But having been in an environment for a very long time where I've observed the role of volunteers firsthand and where, as part of my job duties, I'm actually the coordinator for bringing new volunteers into the organization, I feel like I've gained a perspective that I'd like to be able to share with others. Because as with everything associated with nonprofits, the concept of volunteers is often misunderstood. And when outsiders look in, I think they sometimes fail to appreciate how many nuanced layers there are in the entire process of discovering who should be volunteering with your organization, bringing them in, and helping them long-term to not only support what you're doing, but to grow as an individual, to nurture their own skills, and to be able to have concrete takeaways that will be beneficial to them, whether they continue to work for your organization or if they move elsewhere and apply their time, talents, and abilities towards some other cause. Part of why I think the role of volunteers gets misunderstood is because many people fall into the same trap that I talked about in part 2 of this series, when I was addressing the need for proper business structure and commenting on the fact that sometimes even the founders of nonprofits can tend to look at things through rose-colored glasses. And I think that holds true very much so for people who want to become part of an organization as a volunteer. I think if someone looks at what a particular organization is doing and it really resonates deeply with them, speaks to them at a core level, they can become extremely enamored with the mission and vision of the organization and in the process kind of put blinders on. And what can become particularly troublesome for the individual as well as the organization are those situations where it's simply a case of the wrong person for the job. And in a way, that can seem counterintuitive. Because if an organization doesn't have an operating budget that facilitates hiring staff or enough staff, they relax their standards and they get into the mindset of, well, anybody will do. Finding somebody enthusiastic about volunteering for your organization isn't a guarantee of success. Someone can come in totally excited, motivated, and focused, but bring absolutely nothing to the table. And in those situations where it is the wrong person for the job, two possible things can happen. Either the individual will become completely overwhelmed by what's being asked of them, make many mistakes, and do an incredibly poor job with whatever the function was they were brought in to volunteer for, or sometimes with no one noticing it, they'll kind of relax the standards. Maybe when they realize, oh, this wasn't quite what I thought I was getting into. Some individuals will change things to meet their own needs and their own skills. That can happen under the radar of management or supervisors. And sometimes a little bit farther down the road, you begin to realize that what you thought was running smoothly isn't really running at all. Either way, it puts the organization in a terrible predicament. Now, in some cases, it may be a training issue. Maybe there is a way to get that volunteer up to speed. But if it really is a person who will never be anything but a square peg in a round hole, the organization is now faced with not only maneuvering that person out of the volunteer position, but trying to find someone else, trying to find the right fit. And so I can't encourage enough the pursuit of finding the right person and taking the necessary steps to figure out how to do that. Simply finding someone who raised their hand and said, "Hey, I'll help," is to be avoided at all costs. Now, interestingly enough, one of the components that factors into this is something I covered in Boulder's Part 2, when I talked about how critical it is to have proper business structure. You really need that if you're going to be asking people to volunteer. Because if you bring someone in and you don't have that structure, you're inviting them to be a co-participant in the downfall of whatever your organization is about. No one can succeed in an environment that lacks that kind of structure, least of all a volunteer. It's tempting, again, to get caught up in the enthusiasm of whatever you're pursuing. And you may feel like you're so focused on your cause that you don't even need to read instructions. But the reality is you need to do a lot more than just read instructions. You need to write instructions. You need to not only know what you're doing, but you need to be able to structure it and disseminate it in a way that can help others to learn how to buy into the pursuit of whatever it is you're after. And even if you have the right person, even if you're bringing someone in with a great skill set, if they're not stepping into something that has logical framework, at best, they'll start to do things their own way. Maybe that will work. Maybe it will work well. But ultimately, it will cause an unraveling in the purpose of what you're about. Because even if they're doing something well their own way, if they're not doing it in a consistent way that aligns with what everyone else in the organization is doing, you're not doing yourself any favors. The goal of putting that framework together has to be much more than just remembering how to do things. It has to be about fostering that consistency. And for everyone you bring into your organization, paid or unpaid, you really want to utilize everything they're bringing to the table. Without that structure, you'll never be able to do that. I'd like to briefly talk about a topic that I can't get into a lot of detail on today, but I think talking about it will help to sort of frame this whole idea of volunteering. Because the truth is, there's actually another talent pool that you can tap into for your nonprofit: interns. At the Valor Crisis and Training Center, we've utilized interns various times over the years. And because we're primarily a social services agency, most of those folks were enrolled in social work programs at colleges or universities. Now, utilizing interns has a lot of benefits, Because the people involved in the internship are doing it as part of their college work, they're currently connected to higher learning. And as a result, sometimes you can bring expertise into your organization that maybe nobody on staff has. It's always great to get an outside perspective and a fresh set of eyes. But there's a drawback to utilizing interns as well. Because it's part of a formal college program, there are sometimes high expectations on the part of the institution toward what the nonprofit needs to do to facilitate the internship. Likely, there will be someone within your organization who the intern is assigned to as a field supervisor, and that person will interact with people at the college or university throughout the internship. That can translate into weekly and monthly meetings with professors and liaisons, writing performance appraisals and reviews. And I say that not to scare you away from the idea of interns, but just to make you aware of the reality. It can require a lot of hours to sustain. I mentioned interns because I'd like to touch on something that maybe you never really thought about before. In our nonprofits, we have 3 different classifications that our team members can fall into: paid staff, college interns, and volunteers. Now, we'll go ahead and presume that everybody who's participating in our teams is there because they care about what we're doing. But the reality is, although there are 3 different classifications, at the end of the day, they really only drop into 2 different slots: staff who are compensated and staff who are not. Paid staff receive a paycheck. Interns are doing what they're doing to receive college credit. So in some way, both of those individuals are being compensated. But volunteers aren't taking anything tangible away from the hours that they spend in our organizations, and that is where things can really start to go off the rails. Because they're not receiving something, their focus can start to drift. And I blame a lot of that on the role that the management of the nonprofit plays. One thing I really want to encourage you in: don't ever dumb down a position simply because a volunteer is filling it. In nonprofits, we should hold volunteers to the same level of accountability in terms of business practices and job performance as we would if they were paid staff or an intern, because it really comes down to your client. At the end of the day, if somebody comes to your organization, it shouldn't matter whether they're interacting with staff, intern, or volunteer. They shouldn't know the difference. Everyone should be performing their job function to the same level of expertise, with the same level of conscientiousness, attention to detail, and integrity. And that really comes down to the role that the nonprofit's management plays. You have to esteem your volunteers. Don't treat them like second-class staff. They're as vital a part of your organization as anyone else. Make them feel that way. Give them a buy-in. And through holding them accountable, you'll show them just how significant their contribution is. I think if you do that, you lay a really good long-term framework for keeping people plugged into what your organization is all about. In situations where an organization takes a really casual approach about not only finding and training volunteers, but getting them connected to a relevant position, one of the byproducts of that is that when things go awry, when the volunteer doesn't work out, when there's suddenly this astronomically high turnover rate of volunteers, it can leave management scratching their heads saying, well, how did that happen? According to Nonprofit Quarterly, back in 2008 in the United Kingdom, the UK-based Institute for Volunteering Research conducted a survey of a variety of nonprofits. And it's pretty fascinating. They discovered that 81% of volunteers that they surveyed stated that in whatever role they were volunteering in, they felt that they didn't have proper job descriptions and in many cases had received no training. 81%. So look at it from the inverse. That means that among the volunteers that they surveyed, only 19% had a job description and training. But I look at a statistic like that and I say, That speaks volumes of the overall culture of the nonprofit world. If it were simply isolated instances, you could chalk that up to maybe an inexperienced leader of the nonprofit. But the fact that 81% of volunteers throughout a cross-section of the nonprofit industry gave that kind of a response, to me that indicates that the way we envision the role of nonprofits and the volunteers who serve in them is unfocused at best and distorted at worst. Now, a little bit later on, in 2009, the Institute for Volunteering Research participated in another study. This was a project that they worked jointly with the UK-based National Council for Voluntary Organizations. And the project was called Pathways Through Participation. In the findings, which were compiled based on statistics, surveys, and interviews conducted between 2009 and 2011, the findings were pretty fascinating. Now, certainly, there were a lot of positives and many success stories along the way. But there was a downside as well. When the statistical data was compiled, it was discovered that there's a very high turnover rate among nonprofits. And when volunteers for nonprofits were questioned about this, it was discovered that there are two primary reasons for the high turnover rate. People who leave their volunteer positions at a nonprofit tended to fall in one of two categories. The first was those who felt that there were negative relationships within the organization. And the second was those who left because they felt that there were poor group structures and processes. This again touches on what we talked about in Boulder's Part 2. You need proper business structure to run your nonprofit. But the idea of negative relationships within groups, some of that could be toxic individuals who've come into the company. Maybe it's people who don't really have the organization's best interests at heart. They feel that they know best. The conclusion I draw here is that there's a lot more to finding volunteers than simply taking the first person who says yes. At the Valor Crisis and Training Center, we've not only utilized volunteers for a very long time, but most of us came here as volunteers. Even those who are currently paid staff, in most cases, wound up coming here unpaid, volunteering their time because they cared about the mission of Valor. That was certainly the case for me. I'm the operations manager of the Valor Crisis and Training Center, but I started a long time ago in the summer of 2014, working 1 day a week as a volunteer, checking clients in to our life development classes. In the course of volunteering here, I moved through a variety of positions. I did it kind of slowly and methodically, and I'm glad I did, because it gave me an extremely varied background in doing a lot of different jobs within the organization. And so when I finally stepped into the role of operations manager, it wasn't simply accepting a position. It was clearly understanding what it takes to carry out what we do here day after day. That's given me a very balanced perspective as I've developed policies and procedures. And I think that's crucial for any volunteer. Even if a volunteer never moves into a management position, never becomes paid staff, you want to bring people into your organization who will soberly and carefully learn the job they've been assigned, and who, to the best of their ability, will try to conscientiously meet the requirements of it. If you can find someone like that, you're not simply dealing with an individual who has a couple of hours to kill each week, but you're finding somebody who can invest in your organization, somebody who will be there for the long term. As things develop, their knowledge will increase, and they'll continue to bring deep insight into everything that they do. It will benefit them, keeping them focused, giving them opportunities to grow and try new things, and in the process strengthen everything that you do organizationally. Are you struggling in your organization or nonprofit to find the right kind of volunteer? Again, if you don't have your own processes worked out, it's tough to bring someone from the outside in and say, hey, be a part of this. Valor can help. Our Valor XL division is dedicated to helping other organizations and nonprofits to learn from our expertise and overcome some of the pitfalls that every nonprofit goes through. We're committed to finding practical solutions unique to your own organizational needs. You can reach out to us at info@valorxl.com, and someone from our staff will get back in touch with you. We'll discuss some options with you and get a better understanding of what the challenges are you're facing. We have a powerful tool called Taking Your Organization's Temperature that can be a real eye-opener and show some of the weaknesses that maybe you weren't aware you had. Learn more about what Valor XL can do for you by visiting us on Facebook at Valor XL or our website www.valorxl.com. As we conclude this Boulders series right now, I want to mention that we really do care about sharing topics with you that will be beneficial for what you're going through in your business or in your personal life. If you have suggestions for things you would like us to discuss in future installments of Valor Media, please reach out to us at media@thevalorcenter.org. And if you are a nonprofit, whether you're just getting started, you're trying to maintain what you have, or you're looking for ways to grow, chances are funding is at the top of your priority list. Our executive director, Lori Riston, recently published a comprehensive course called Face Your Fears. It's your complete guide to grant writing. It will navigate you through all the complex twists and turns of identifying and writing relevant grants for your nonprofit. You can get more details at www.valorxl.com/training. Please like and subscribe to the Valor Media podcast as we bring a new episode to you every Monday, either in our Valor XL or our Crisis to Thriving series. And if this podcast benefits you, would you consider benefiting us by financially assisting us so that we can continue to bring you this kind of content? If so, you can make your tax-deductible donation securely online by visiting us at www.thevalorcenter.org and clicking on the Donate button. Or you can send a check or money order to Valor Ministries, 324 East Antietam Street, Suite 104, Hagerstown, Maryland, 21740. Thanks again for joining me today. If you joined me for all 3 installments of the Boulders series, I hope I've been able to share things with you that will be beneficial for you to identify those boulders that are lying in your path. They're only insurmountable if you let them there. If you deal with them, if you move them out of your way, then you have easy access to all the fertile soil of whatever your nonprofit is trying to cultivate. Thanks again. Please come back next week, and until then, remember this: you were made to thrive.